You know what's painful? Loving someone who pulls away every time things get close. Avoidants are experts at distancing themselves. But here's the thing they don't expect. The very moment you stop chasing and start shifting, that's when they begin to feel the absence. So if you're anxious and tired of feeling powerless, listen closely, because doing these three things might just flip the script in ways you never imagined. When you're anxiously attached, your first instinct in a relationship, especially with someone avoidant, is to seek reassurance. You want to feel safe, seen, and secure. Every time they pull away, your anxiety kicks in, and you go looking for signs that everything is still okay. You send that extra text. You ask questions that sound harmless, like, "Are we okay?" or "Did I do something wrong?" You overanalyze every message they send or don't send. You overthink the tone in their voice, the delay in their reply, or the way they seem distracted. And the whole time you're not doing this because you're needy. You're doing it because you're scared. You're scared of abandonment, of not being enough, of losing someone who felt like they were finally giving you something real. But here's what you don't always realize. The more reassurance you seek, the more you reinforce a dynamic where they are in control and you are on edge. Every time you reach out for confirmation, it's like handing them the emotional steering wheel. It tells them that they don't need to offer more security because you'll keep doing the emotional work for both of you. The avoidant gets to stay distant, guarded, and unavailable, while you bend, explain, chase, and wait. But the problem is, reassurance from them doesn't last. Even when you get it, it's temporary. It's like a drop of water when you're thirsty in the desert. You feel relief for a moment, but then the fear creeps back in. You start needing more and more reassurance to feel okay, and this dynamic begins to drain you. It creates a pattern where you're constantly seeking and they're constantly retreating. And the more you try to close the gap, the more exhausted and disconnected you feel. But something shifts when you stop seeking that constant reassurance. When you stop trying to make them feel comfortable enough to stay. When you no longer chase validation from someone who only gives it to you in small, controlled doses. At first, it feels unnatural. You're used to filling the silence, fixing the mood, explaining your feelings in the hope that it brings you closer. But there's a quiet power in pausing, in not asking them what's wrong the second you feel a shift in their energy, in choosing to sit with your discomfort rather than outsourcing it to them. That moment of stillness isn't just silence, it's a declaration. Not to them, but to yourself. It says, "I can hold my own." And it's in that stillness that things begin to change. Not just in the relationship dynamic, but in you. You begin to hear your own voice again. You start noticing how much energy you've been spending on trying to regulate someone else's emotional distance just so you can feel secure. And when you stop doing that, something incredible happens. You take your power back. When you stop seeking reassurance, you're no longer reacting to every shift in their behavior. You're no longer spiraling when they go quiet or change their tone. Instead, you begin observing. You see things more clearly. You see that their silence isn't always your fault, that their pullback might not be about you at all, that your worth isn't determined by how quickly they respond to your messages or how much they reciprocate your efforts. You're no longer in a constant state of needing them to validate your place in their life. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you shut off your emotions or pretend not to feel. It means you start leading with calm instead of panic. You stop filling every gap with explanation and over-communication. And when you no longer ask for constant reassurance, you give them the space to feel the weight of their own actions or inaction. Because when you stop reminding them that you're still there, they're left to face the silence they've created. In that silence, they either notice the absence and realize the value you brought, or they drift. But either way, you're no longer dancing for crumbs. You're standing in a place of quiet strength that says, "I know what I bring. I don't have to keep proving it." And in that shift, the avoidance starts to feel what they never expected. The loss of someone they assumed would always be available. Because the moment you stop seeking reassurance is the moment the emotional dynamic begins to shift. Not through confrontation, not through blame, but through stillness, through groundedness, through you choosing to regulate you instead of trying to regulate them. When you've been anxiously attached to someone who constantly pulls away, it's easy to fall into a pattern where your entire world begins to revolve around them. Every decision, every thought, every shift in your mood becomes entangled with what they're doing or not doing. You start measuring your day based on how available they are, how warm or cold they seem, how responsive they're being. Without even realizing it, you slowly begin to pour all your emotional energy outward, toward them. You think about how to phrase your messages so they don't feel pressured. You analyze your tone to keep things light. You plan your day around when they might be free to talk. And through all of that, you're slowly abandoning yourself in favor of preserving whatever fragile connection you still feel with them. The anxious part of you believes that if you can just give a little more, be a little more accommodating, a little more understanding, then maybe, just maybe, they'll finally feel safe enough to show up consistently. But the harder you try, the more they retreat. They sense the pressure, even if it's unspoken. They feel the energy of someone leaning in too hard, and instead of reciprocating, they pull away. And in that moment, you feel the panic again, the need to do more, to fix the disconnect, to reclaim the closeness that's always just out of reach. But here's the truth. There is a point where constantly giving doesn't create connection. It just creates imbalance. And when all of your emotional resources are being invested in someone else, you end up emotionally bankrupt yourself. That's why reclaiming your energy becomes the turning point. Because instead of using your thoughts, time, and emotions to try and manage their inconsistency, you start directing that same energy back into you. You start becoming aware of how often your mental space is consumed by them, checking your phone, rehearsing conversations, second-guessing yourself. And you start interrupting that cycle, not by punishing them or cutting them off, but by choosing to reinvest in the parts of you that have been neglected. It might begin subtly. You stop over-explaining when they seem distant. You go out and do something for yourself instead of waiting around to hear from them. You reconnect with friends you haven't really shown up for because your emotional bandwidth was being drained elsewhere. You bring your focus back to your goals, your creativity, your peace, and in doing that, something starts to shift, not just inside of you, but in the space between you and them. Avoidants are used to being chased. They're used to emotional energy being directed toward them, even when they're unavailable. But when that attention starts to fade, when the anxious person they took for granted is no longer pouring into the dynamic, something uncomfortable happens for them. For the first time, they're not being fed by the constant validation. They're not being soothed by your presence. They're left to feel the emotional gap they created. And that gap feels different when you're no longer trying to close it. Reclaiming your energy isn't about being cold or indifferent. It's about recognizing that your emotional resources are valuable and they shouldn't be spent trying to earn someone's affection or presence. It's about realizing that when you center yourself, when you start prioritizing your own needs, your nervous system begins to calm. You're no longer in a state of emotional alertness, waiting for the next withdrawal. You're no longer living in reaction to someone else's patterns. And the person who once held all the power in the dynamic starts to notice that you're no longer orbiting around them. What used to be their comfort zone, the emotional chase where they held the distance and you held the responsibility, starts to feel unfamiliar. They may not know how to name it, but they feel it. They feel your energy no longer chasing. They feel the absence of your constant availability. And in that absence, they begin to sense the cost of their emotional unavailability. But for you, the shift is deeper. Because the moment you start pouring your energy into yourself instead of someone else, you begin to remember who you are without the anxiety. You remember what it feels like to be grounded, to be full, to not need constant reassurance from someone who was never consistent to begin with. Your world expands again. Your clarity returns. You begin to see the relationship not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of truth. You begin to ask different questions, not how do I keep them close? But is this really what I want to keep close? And that simple shift of energy away from them and back to you starts to change everything about the connection and the way you experience it. When you're anxiously attached, much of your behavior is driven by fear, not because you're weak, but because somewhere deep inside, you're constantly scanning for signs that the person you care about might leave, pull away, or decide you're not enough. That fear becomes the engine behind how you show up in relationships. You compromise, you minimize your needs. You try not to be too much, even when you're in pain. You overlook red flags. You justify mixed signals and inconsistent behavior by telling yourself that everyone has issues, and that if you just love them enough, they'll eventually feel safe enough to love you the way you want to be loved. And all of this creates a version of you that is operating from survival, not from self-worth. You begin measuring your value based on how well you can maintain the connection. If they're still texting, if they're still coming around, if they're not completely walking away, you take it as a win, even if they're not meeting your emotional needs. You internalize the message that being chosen, even inconsistently, is better than not being chosen at all. And in that space, you shrink. You start to trade depth for crumbs of attention. You rationalize poor communication, emotional distance, or dismissive behavior because at least they haven't left. But deep down, you feel the cost. You feel the exhaustion of being in a relationship where you can't rest emotionally, where you're constantly guessing, tiptoeing, managing their moods, wondering if today will be a good day or one where they disappear into themselves again. And here's where things begin to change. When you stop relating to love through fear and start relating to it through worth. When you pause long enough to ask yourself not just whether they want you, but whether their way of loving actually honors you, whether it feeds your emotional safety or continually starves it. When you stop trying to earn love and start getting honest about what you actually deserve, not from a place of arrogance, not from ego, but from clarity. Because when your self-worth is clear, your standards evolve. You don't settle for someone who only loves you in fragments. You don't normalize inconsistency just because the chemistry is intense or the connection is complicated. You start to recognize that love isn't supposed to make you feel unstable. It's not supposed to keep you on edge. The moment you redefine what you deserve is the moment you begin showing up differently. You speak more directly. You say what you need without apologizing for it. You stop begging to be understood by someone who keeps misunderstanding you by choice. And you stop translating their avoidance into your inadequacy. You realize that their inability to connect emotionally isn't proof that you're too much. It's a reflection of their limitations. You no longer interpret distance as a puzzle you need to solve. Instead, you start asking whether you're in a space where your emotional needs are even compatible with theirs. This shift is subtle but powerful. You're no longer just reacting to their behavior, you're evaluating whether their behavior aligns with your values. You begin making decisions from a place of inner stability, not emotional chaos. You stop waiting for them to come around and start choosing yourself in small, consistent ways. That might look like stepping back instead of over-explaining. It might look like saying no to a last-minute plan that disrespects your time. It might look like no longer initiating every conversation, giving them the space to show whether they're willing to meet you halfway. And while the avoidant might not fully understand what's changed, they feel it. They feel that you're no longer playing the same role. They feel that you're no longer emotionally dependent on their approval. They sense that the dynamic has shifted, not because you're trying to teach them a lesson, but because you're finally honoring yourself. You're not as easily swayed by mixed signals. You don't collapse at the first sign of withdrawal. You become someone who values emotional safety more than temporary connection, someone who can hold space for love, but not at the cost of your dignity. This redefinition doesn't make you colder. It makes you clearer. It sharpens your vision. You stop seeing potential as a reason to stay, and you start demanding presence. You stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional intimacy, and you start realizing that the right person won't require you to question whether your needs are too much. They'll respect them without negotiation. You begin to align your life not around who chooses you, but around what you're no longer willing to tolerate. Because when your worth is non-negotiable, so are your boundaries. And in that place, the old anxious patterns begin to fall away, not because you forced yourself to change, but because you finally remembered what it feels like to be rooted in your own value. When you're anxiously attached to someone who leans avoidant, silence feels unbearable. The gap between messages, the unreturned calls, the unanswered questions, it all becomes a trigger. You feel this urge to fill the space. You reach out, you explain, you chase, you tell yourself you're just trying to keep the connection alive, but underneath it all is a deep fear that if you don't act, they'll disappear. And so you do everything in your power to keep the thread intact. You send one more message to clarify your tone. You ask one more question just to feel close. You offer reassurance, even when you're the one feeling neglected. The silence makes you uncomfortable. And instead of sitting in it, you try to fix it. Not because you want to control the other person, but because silence to you feels like rejection. But here's the thing. Avoidants are comfortable with space. They often thrive in it. When you back off emotionally, they don't immediately see that as a loss. They feel relief. They equate distance with safety. So when you're anxiously attached, that response feels maddening. It's like you're pouring your heart out to a wall. You're trying to build closeness, but they keep leaning away. And every time you fill the space they create, you reinforce the cycle. You do the emotional labor. You maintain the connection. You make sure things don't fall apart. But the truth is, in that dynamic, your silence would be louder than your words ever were. Creating space instead of filling it is not about playing games. It's about breaking the pattern that keeps you in an emotional loop of overfunctioning. It's about resisting the urge to fix, to chase, to explain. It's about choosing to let the silence speak for itself, because when you stop filling the space, the dynamic shifts. The avoidant partner, who has been used to you doing the work of connection, suddenly has nothing to react to. They're left alone in the gap they created. And it's in that gap that reflection begins. Not because you pushed them, but because you stopped pulling. When you no longer rush in to close the emotional distance, you create room for them to feel the discomfort of absence. For the first time, they're not being met with reassurance or accommodation. They're being met with stillness. And in that stillness, they're left to sit with their own behavior, with the weight of their withdrawal, with the possibility that your silence doesn't mean anger, it might mean you're done. And that's a powerful realization for someone who has always relied on emotional space to avoid vulnerability. It's in this space that the avoidant begins to question what they once took for granted. They start to notice the absence of your emotional availability, the subtle things, the way you used to reach out first, the way you used to ask if they were okay, the way you softened tension before it escalated. Those things are no longer happening. And instead of being chased, they're now confronted with a choice. They can either step forward or they can let the silence grow louder. But either way, they no longer have the comfort of your constant presence. For you, holding that space is an act of self-respect. It's not easy. It takes everything in you not to send that message, not to explain how you feel, not to rush in and fix the discomfort. But every time you choose not to fill the silence, you're choosing yourself. You're choosing not to be the one who always compensates. You're letting the space speak what your words no longer will, because sometimes your silence is the only thing that gets their attention. Not because it's a tactic, but because it disrupts the emotional pattern they've grown used to. When you're anxiously attached, this kind of stillness feels like emotional withdrawal, but it's not. It's emotional clarity. It's you realizing that your value doesn't increase with your effort. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let someone feel the full weight of your absence. Not to hurt them, not to manipulate them, but to honor yourself. To stop showing up for a connection that leaves you drained. To stop filling the gaps with more of yourself when the other person is unwilling to meet you there. This silence, this space, it's not a punishment. It's a boundary. A quiet line in the sand that says, if you want to be here, you have to meet me. You have to participate. You have to notice. And if you don't, I won't keep chasing the version of you that only shows up when it's convenient. Because while you used to rush in to preserve the connection, now you're letting the connection do some of the work on its own. And in that space, the avoidant is left to decide what that connection really means without your constant effort holding it together. One of the most powerful things you can do as someone who's anxiously attached is to stop arguing for your worth. Because that's what you've probably been doing without even realizing it. Every time you try to prove your value to someone who stays emotionally unavailable, every time you explain your feelings hoping they'll finally understand, Every time you chase after clarity from someone who keeps giving you confusion, you're making a silent case that you're worth choosing. And it's exhausting. You tell yourself that if you just say it right, if you can just be patient enough, loving enough, forgiving enough, they'll see you, appreciate you, commit to you. But all the while, you're pouring energy into a dynamic where the other person isn't even showing up with both feet. You're in a relationship where you're doing most of the emotional heavy lifting, and the longer it goes on, the more it begins to chip away at how you see yourself. It starts with small things, like letting them cancel plans last minute without consequence, or making excuses when they act distant. But over time, those compromises become your new standard. You start measuring connection based on whether they responded to your message instead of how safe and seen you feel with them. You begin accepting inconsistency as a normal part of love. And when they finally do something kind or present, you cling to it as proof that your effort is working, that if you just hang on long enough, they'll finally become the partner you need them to be. But that's the trap, because when someone is avoidant, they often don't feel the urgency to change until they feel the loss. And that loss won't come while you're still fighting to prove you're enough. The moment you stop arguing for your worth is the moment things shift. You no longer feel the need to defend your value. You stop over-explaining why your needs matter. You stop asking someone to treat you better, hoping your vulnerability will soften them. You stop chasing resolution from a person who avoids confrontation. And instead, you begin walking in the quiet confidence that your worth is not up for debate. You begin holding your needs not as negotiable requests, but as boundaries that protect your peace. You start valuing your emotional energy enough not to waste it on someone who only shows up halfway. And when that happens, the avoidant notices. Because for the first time, they're not being met with effort. They're being met with absence.